Okay, so I'm just going to talk through this. There'll be no sort of audio-visual things here. And really what I'm trying to do is just sort of map out two things really, sort of terms and things I've been trying to clarify for myself regarding what we as practitioners, as theorists, mean when we talk about matter or make reference to matter under the rubric of sort of sonic materialism. So this is my kind of sort of first of two aims, and then towards the end of this talk, what I'm sort of hoping to do is to acknowledge Brian Kane's critique of onto-aesthetics, which, thank you for that wonderful term, which is sort of very kind of helpful. And generally, I mean, Brian can sort of perhaps update later on if I bludgeon his critique here. But the critique of this being that an ontological orientation that sort of an approach to sonic materialism entails is carried out at the expense of the necessary attention to detail regarding auditory culture and things like this. And I'll just sort of crudely summarize it like that, Brian's critique there. I think the critique is sort of very much kind of spot on in lots of ways and really interesting. But for those of us who are interested in sort of ontological turn or concepts of realism, I was quite interested in how that critique of onto-aesthetics could actually perhaps lead to people doing that better. Okay, that ontological turn. Okay, so how it could be perhaps be used in that way. Exploring these concepts of matter, then, what I want to talk about, this will kind of involve also discussing how people use this term real or reality that goes along with that, and where that is situated in relation to listening subjects. Okay, whether this is a kind of affective interiority, some kind of scientific objective exteriority, and so on, and things like that. So these are the kind of things I'm trying to map out and use this talk to do some work for myself here as well, to try and sort of map these things out as well. Okay, so within this ontological turn, then, we can think of sonic materialism as being sort of a dominant kind of strain, if you like, most clearly kind of expressed notion of an ontological turn. And this particularly in the work of Christoph Cox, of course, with this being the sort of subtitle of the Beyond Representation paper, and also Salome Vogelin, because of the chapter on this in Sonic Possible Worlds. And so these are the two people that I sort of want to talk a little bit about today, and these concepts of matter and materialism that come through them. Both of these authors then define sonic materialism as identifying that which is kind of in sound and resistant to representation, to conceptualization, or more broadly to the symbolic. And this is partly sort of entails a metaphysics of sound that sonic materialism posits as sort of, inherently resistant to representation by its very nature. And this isn't something that I really endorse. This is something that's sort of implicated in sonic materialism. And I think there's sort of lots of problems with that, which I'll come to. Due to this sort of opposition towards representational thought and conceptualism, sonic materialism then proceeds according to a kind of affective methodology or way of thinking. Okay, and the opposition that then arises out of opposing sort of the affective world of sonic materialism to the conceptual representational modes of thought fits very neatly into Jonathan Stern's critique of the audiovisual litany. These are just the sort of terms of that, and just to not assume that everybody just knows that term here. This is Stern's critique of the audiovisual litany, was a critique of the idea that sound, according to some kind of metaphysics, required a different type of language or mode of address or something like that, and was generally expressed in a kind of opposition of terms. So we have an oral side to this, which is to do with sound being inherently omnidirectional, inherently immersive, affective, to do with subjective interiority and so on. And this is what was proper to auditory culture. And on the other side is the visual to which it's opposed, which is to do with the directional, the linear, the distanced, surface exteriority and so on. And these are generally how these things are, to crudely summarize again, opposed. Okay, and so the affective register within which sonic materialism ascribes itself is sort of firmly within that, operating within the terms of the audiovisual litany there. And this leads it, I think, sonic materialism to kind of assume a sort of ontological priority due to what it asserts as being a kind of supplementary nature of the symbolic or so. Okay, I'll come back to that shortly. That assertion then of ontological priority, the idea that sound attains a certain proximity to the real and so on, follows along the lines of a kind of argument whereby what is real flows beneath the static domain of signs and the symbolic, okay? And that this kind of, that which flows beneath this static domain of signs or the visual is sort of populated by affects and flux and so on and so on, is generally how that argument goes. So this brings us into a kind of the relationship of affect theory to these two authors here. Cox and Vogelin both assert a primacy of the affective, but the concepts of the affects for the two of these people are really quite different. For Vogelin, we have a sort of primacy of the auto-affective, subjective interiority, these kinds of things, whereas for Cox, the affective is taken in a more broadly Deleuzian context, which encompasses this notion of an autonomy of affects, which inscribes it within a sort of semi-naturalistic domain of real forces and so on, and sound being one of those forces. I'll come back to Cox specifically shortly. Okay, so Vogelin says that sonic materialism is a phenomenological materialism in her most recent book, Sonic Possible Worlds. And it's a really nice, straightforward, clear alignment of that there, I think. And does some really, is sort of very helpful moment of clarity in pinning down sort of what certain people mean by matter when we're talking about sonic materialism here. It also distinguishes it from Cox quite well. What I want to do is just sort of do a little kind of mapping with some of Vogelin's work and Michel Henry's material phenomenology. I think these two things for me have worked really well together in terms of the similarities, in terms of argument there in some ways, particularly because Henry is outlining a philosophical program of thought, if you like, as opposed to doing the kind of generative poetics that Salme is involved in her writing and so on. So I found that quite useful in grasping what is meant by her version of sonic materialism here. So Henry's material phenomenology sought to kind of try and reclaim some of what Husserlian phenomenology apparently, according to Henry, lost sight of. That being the sort of materiality, the reality of immediate auto-affective experience, the self-givenness of life, as opposed to pursuing sort of ideal universal essences, perhaps through sort of intentionality and so on. And in both Henry's material phenomenology and Vogelin's sonic materialism, there's a critique of seeing and the priority of the scene, which again follows the structure of the audiovisual litany, in many ways favouring, or which rather ascribes to seeing transcendence rather than the immanence of the sonic, distance rather than intimacy, abstraction rather than the concrete, and so on. Okay, and against the sort of transcendence of vision that both Henry and Vogelin ascribe to it, both assert the kind of reality of auto-affective immanence, and this is where reality is kind of is positioned for these authors, and this auto-affectivity for Vogel in particular is sort of proper to the sonic, okay, in terms of this audiovisual litany which is used. Also, interestingly, Henry talks about how an orientation towards seeing has led to a sort of neglect of auditory culture as well, or hearing, perhaps, more precisely there. So lots of similarities there. So this notion of affect then is auto-affective subjective interiority in Vogelin's sonic materialism. Cox's sonic materialism, again, so as I said previously, is distinctive from this. The affect is put in a broadly Deleuzian context as in an autonomy of affects, not bound to emotion or the felt and lived of a listening subject, but considered as a kind of autonomous force of which sound is one of these forces. And this, importantly for Cox, gives him a kind of non-anthropocentric theory of affects, which fits into the philosophical naturalism of trying to think of nature independent of the mind and escape correlationism and so on as part of the realist project that he's working with there. Also interestingly, actually, no, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the, if anybody's interested in the way that the intensive functions as a channel between the virtual and actual aspects of his ontology, we can chat about that over a pint later on. Okay. So there's distinctions then between these two versions of sonic materialism. One positing affects as interior auto-affective elements of subjectivity, another as something which somehow kind of interfaces with a naturalistic sort of exteriority, if we like, there. So there are distinctions between that, between these different concepts of matter and so on, and affectivity there. Common to both projects of sonic materialism, however, is this idea that sound is somehow kind of more real or more appropriate to addressing the real in some ways, or refashions the real, because again, there's a sort of assertion that what is real is always in flux and always becoming and so on and so on. And sound, as we experience it, is always in flux and always becoming and so on and so on. And so therefore sound is more appropriate to sort of probing these depths as they're sort of positioned of reality and so on, as opposed to the visual, which is through its apparent static representational nature cast into irreality. Okay. So this concept of reality then we sort of arrive at. For Vogelin, this is positioned within auto-affective subjectivity. And for Cox, this is positioned again, regarding to within an exterior, perhaps sort of domain. It's a slight simplification. I'll come to that shortly. The notion of matter that Vogelin works with that goes with this positioning of the real within subjective interiority. The matter then pertains to sort of sensorial events of a contingent encounter that automatically boil down to this auto-affective kind of synthesis. Cox positions his own work as a realist conception of sound as an a-signifying material flux. Okay, so there's that resistance to the representational and everything that sort of goes along with that there. In contrast to the phenomenological concept of matter then that we get in Vogelin's sonic materialism, in Cox we get he sort of will start to align his materialism with things like sort of biology and chemistry and so on, and so we end up with what I sort of will crudely boil down to calling it a physicalist concept of matter. Okay, so again we have these two different sort of concepts of matter operating within sonic materialism there. And as I've said, for Cox this is positioned in excess of the subject, but not strictly just outside, which is that would insert a strict divide between subjective and an exterior world, but as an excess which provides the conditions of subjective interiority. Okay, so this is the kind of immanence that he's trying to work with there. And this, I should say at this point, is like, I would say, like, generally, I'm for this kind of in some ways, like in many ways, go Cox, go ontology, yay realism. Okay. And so I'm sort of trying to think through these things here as to what's the best mode of doing this, and what's a good way of addressing these questions. And I think I'm sort of really with Cox in terms of where he's going, and I think it's really interesting what he's trying to explore and get at, and so on. But in his work as well, we also find the same assumption of the terms and oppositions of the audiovisual litany that we find in people like Vogelin and so on, okay? So the same kind of methodological impositions are put into place regarding the appropriateness of the representational and conceptual to sonic practice and theory, okay? And that's where I think that there's an issue here for me, and something that to be worked through, and I'm not really going to answer in full right now, but really pinning the problem and where I perhaps will go with this later. the adherence to the audiovisual litany entails a certain rejection of the cognitive, conceptual, representational, and the purchase this might have and have been shown to have in other disciplines and so on. Okay, and the mode considered proper to an access of the vibrational flux of reality that a sonorous ontology posits is that of a kind of affective or intuitive sort of mode of access. But I think what we end up with is a kind of then a sort of two claims on the nature of the transcendental within Cox's arguments. Okay, we get a sort of transcendental realism or something, which is situating this all in some kind of material physicalist domain, but then because the mode of access proper to that domain is this kind of affective one, we get an affective, a transcendental affectivity, which comes straight out of Henri's material phenomenology in many ways. So there's almost like a short circuit back into the phenomenology because of the mode of access, which is considered proper to this kind of sonorous conception of the real there. So it's almost like the materialism in Cox's argument impedes the realism in Cox's argument in this then, okay? These two competing claims then on this transcendental here, I think also is indicative of a kind of a sleight of hand whereby the concept of matter also becomes ambiguous in the same way that both concepts of matter are entertained sort of almost simultaneously. We have the autonomous ontology of affects that's posited is done in a kind of realist physicalist kind of sense, and then simultaneously the only mode of access to that is via sort of affective embodied intuition, and so these two things become conflated there, okay? And that's where we arrive kind of at Brian's wonderful term again of ontoaesthetics there for me personally, okay? These two things sort of bound together there, and you can tell me how appropriate or not that assumption is later on, I think. So in that then this method, this sort of impediment to the realist project in Cox, materialism almost stands in the way of that, as this materialism within sonic materialism always seems to kind of short-circuit itself back towards being a phenomenology, which Cox is considers sort of problematic, and appears sort of somewhat kind of ill-suited towards this exit from, or this challenge to sort of correlationism that he's also interested in, and that I'm also interested in. Okay, so I'm kind of trying to figure out a kind of a tactics here through this. So to what extent is that materialism really useful in carrying out that realist sort of project there? How am I doing for time?
I think you have
Yeah.
It's been a long day.
No, it's fine. I'm on 18 minutes and 14 seconds. So okay. What I'll do is at this point, because my intention for talks always exceeds my temporal perception, and I'll apologise for a certain amount of false advertising and saying that I'm really going to talk also about transcendental empiricism. But that's kind of a bit of another. There's quite a lot of setup in that, but as something which perhaps dissolves some of these ambiguities around materialism and situates the real within the auditory auditory physiology and so on. And there's less discussion of that in discourse on sound studies and so on than there is. But actually, lots of interesting artists working in terms of psychoacoustics and so on, I think, bring this. Pose an interesting challenge there. Now, all I'm going to do is throw that out there like some kind of what the F was that thing that perhaps some people might want to discuss later on, as I kind of advertised that I would probably talk about that. But I think saying that some of these, I think what's probably a good point to leave it on is to what extent is this sonic materialism really an appropriate project for the realist project that also runs through Cox's work that I'm also quite interested in. And I will leave it at that because that's 20 minutes.
Thank you. The floor is open for comments. Thanks, Will. You did great with the term. I recognize the term. That's what I meant by it, so that's good.
Good.
Oh, okay, at the end you throw out this wager, or kind of, I don't know. It's like it's bait, I gotta take it, about psychoacoustics and as being a domain where one might be able to ground a kind of transcendental empiricism. So let me ask you this. So Jonathan Stern has said a lot of things about psychoacoustics, right? Especially in the MP3 book. And it seems to me that, Stern's in a way critical of psychoacoustics as a kind of empiricism, right? This is the argument that he makes about hearing and listening, right? That what we that we construct hearing on the basis of listening, meaning we have to do construct all kinds of phenomenotechniques and tests and things like that in order to glean what the basis of hearing is, right?
Yeah.
And that itself is, in a way, Stern's argument, I think, is akin to the kind of the way that I'm thinking about ontology here, that there's a whole lot of mediation that's involved in it, and then somehow listening is then hearing is stuck before listening, and given a kind of psychoacoustic scientific empiricist foundation that is supposed to, then guarantee the claims of listening. But in a way, it could work in the opposite direction, and the way that we construct hearing would then be begging the question of listening, in the same way that ontoaesthetics, the ontological, ends up begging the question of culture. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if that's how Stern describes psychoacoustics, how does psychoacoustics then offer a way out of this impasse through something like
Good. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to start broaching the last page. I think because of it, it identifies a limit or a threshold there. I don't think it's a kind of a way out of it, like into unmediated sort of access. I think that's one of the big problems there. I think that one of the things I think so if the conflation of ontoaesthetics then is partly informs a sonic materialism which impedes this sort of realist project or something like that. Okay, I think one of the interesting thing about psychoacoustics, transcendental empiricism, yes, these things work through systems of representation and cultural technique in order to arrive at what they think are their own conditions in many ways, and so on. And absolutely, I think that the use of that cultural technique is essential, and the idea that somehow we can circumvent it is sort of not, I think, a false argument. What I think is interesting about the reason I was interested in and was tempted to try and accelerate my speech to the extent that I could fit all that into this talk, which I said not to, is that with transcendental empiricism then tries to look at the conditions of experience and so on, okay? Tries to move beyond the appearances of phenomenology in the Deleuze's project to look at how those appearances arrive, and principally through a kind of embodied kind of synthesis, really, there. And in many ways, if I'm trying to sort of take that out of philosophy and put it into these kind of sonic practices, then psychoacoustics is a kind of good way of looking at that, because it's looking at how the internal synthetic engine, for want of a better word, of the body is generating these things. It's looking at the conditions of auditory perception in that way. And I think that's a good place to say, if we're looking for a real beyond appearances, which a lot of these things sort of seem to do what this realist project is, that's a good place of locating that for sound, because then after that, that's kind of something else. And one of the, if we're in a Jacob Kierkegaard piece, for instance, or in a Florian Hecker piece, or something like this, or listening to Ben Vida or something like that, which make use of difference tones, etc., etc. It's that schism which is forced. This is an internal synthesis here, and outside of that is something else. And I think actually that severance that puts in between those two can actually allow you to do the auditory culture stuff almost kind of better, because they're not trying to squeeze it into, build that on top of an ontology and out of that, so that, which gets you into the audiovisual litany. And by cutting that off almost then almost the ontology can be done better as well, okay? And we have to sort of say, well, where is that ontology being done better? Perhaps not in sound studies, okay? It's perhaps being done in these other disciplines and so on. And so I think that the fact that my sort of conflation of transcendental empiricism and psychoacoustics is almost like a threshold. It's a limit or a horizon for those things. And by identifying that limit, sort of both things could probably operate better. To what extent can we keep that ontology going rather than abandon it because of the methodological problems, as I would see them, if that answers your question. Okay.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, Will. And I'm Jamie Allen. Hi.
Hi.
I was just curious about different kinds of physiologies. Like when you say this about the sort of the schism between. I mean, what you were saying there made me think of op art and stuff like that as well.
Yeah.
Or chapels of extreme experience and burrows and these kinds of stroboscopic experiences and stuff like that, which obviously kind of test the same kind of schisms, and people talk about being able to see your perception. So all that is very physiological and specifically human as well, right? Like there's also this idea. I just wonder how useful it is to maybe look at cross-species hearing and listening, or maybe that's a bit of a left field, but or maybe just how important is physiology in that?
I think when we're talking about sound varying, and I think that sort of, I think if we're going to sort of talk about it in an aesthetic register, then, and we're seeking to sort of ground that in some kind of transcendental thinking, then doing that in sort of grounding that transcendental empiricism in a kind of physiological conditions of audition, I think is kind of a good sign for that. And so physiology I think is really important to that in many ways. And I think in some ways, I mean, I'm just going to sort of improv sort of through that trans-species, interspecies thing there. But perhaps in terms of, where that kind of is interesting is because of, again, it helps to pinpoint a sort of divide and to separate these things out again in some ways. Because of different bandwidths of audibility, okay, so that kind of sets the limit at different places, and it sort of probes around and involves different techniques for mapping out differing sort of territories of the real and where that's situated, I would say. Again, like I said, that's not something I've thought through, but that differing thresholds, different physiologies would perhaps be, could be useful as testing different limit cases for that, as where that schism is made, perhaps, would be the only thing I could think of off the top of my head now.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.